Okay, we should be good.
All right, I'm going to open the Moab City Pre-Council Workshop at 4:06 p.m. And the first item on and the only item on the agenda is just a briefing and a discussion on the update on Ordinance 2022-05 that amends the Moab Municipal Code R3, R4 zones with an active employee household percentage. And then we're also going to be hearing from BAE Urban Economics to give us their report on what their findings are and what the data is that they've collected. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn this right over to you, Corey, and we'll get started. And I think let's go ahead and let the presentation begin. And then if council, if you have some pressing questions that you want to ask in the middle of the presentation, feel free to do that. But if we could wait till after we hear from staff and our BAE Urban Economics folks, that would be great. But if you have something pressing you want to ask, clarification wise, please feel free to do that. So go ahead, Corey, you're up.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mayor, Council, for this opportunity to dive into this draft ordinance. I really appreciate our participation from Robert and Nate on behalf of Snow Christensen Martineau, and then Matt and Aaron with BAE. Making the time to have everyone in the same room is really what's going to help, I think, bring this ordinance together. So again, for sake of time, and we do have a good workshop scheduled, but would like to go through a basic outline of what the discussion topics might hopefully be today. And then we can always return to any of these topics at any point. I know Aaron with BAE has a hard stop at 5:30, but I think we should be able to move through the presentation as proposed, accommodating time there. Within the updates, what we'd like to do very first, after this presentation, of course, is address any outstanding questions or concerns regarding the Resolution 33/2021, which is the enaction of that pending ordinance doctrine that initiated this ordinance development. So I do know there were some questions from council still lingering for that. So any opportunity that Robert or Nate can address those, we'll try to get that out of the way so that we're done with the resolution discussion and move on to the ordinance discussion. Following that, we'll go through that ordinance and public engagement timeline update, ordinance framework and overview, essentially what was submitted in the packet as the draft framework for the ordinance. There was substantial content included in that, but that is a starting place. So appreciate everyone's detailed questions regarding some of that substance, but that is what we're going to be working through of how to shape some of that content, as long as the framework is structured in a way that we want to move forward. Allow Robert and Nate to discuss some of the content considerations moving forward, how we might shape some of that content so that it is going to draft in a way that agrees with the process in which we're developing the ordinance, and then leave a really good amount of time for BAE to walk through the parameters of their data and calculations formula that they have generated so far, where we're at in that process, what we're needing to do to complete that data, and then what would be the resulting number, and then the idea of what we're going to do with that number once we get it, how that's going to work into the ordinance. And by the number, I mean a percentage related to active employment households. So I'm going to stop sharing screen really quick and we'll come right back to this, but wanted to offer up a quick opportunity for any lingering questions about the resolution by council.
Ronnie.
I think the only one, Corey, that I had asked you that was linked to the original resolution was the inclusion of R2. I went back and looked at the minutes and Q&A exchanges then. And so clearly we as a group decided to include R2 at the time. I just kind of wanted to ask colleagues, because I understand that R2 is probably not going to see a multifamily development, on the way R2 is written now. So I was just going to see if anybody remembered why we included R2 at the time. I mean, I know we had discussions about including commercial as well as residential, and we felt like residential was what we could bite off now. But does anyone remember why R2 is left in there? And why it's out now?
I can respond to the first one, I think. So as it was originally formulated, it's to add requirements that new residential development of more than 2 households be subject to the requirements. Some of the units must qualify as active employment household, blah, blah, blah. So I thought that it might also be applicable to subdivisions and PUDs, and basically to, if they were more than 2, even if there was 3 single family residences, that it would be applicable. And I will leave it to others to explain why that is not in the scope of the current considerations.
Right, and that's perfect. I agree with that, and appreciate Kaylin's input from that prior. And why we're not seeing that now is what we're designing this ordinance around is a use parameter, which is a specific permitted use within a zone. What that R2 in the context in which Kaylin talked about it would infer is a redevelopment of our subdivision ordinance, so that we would be linking multiple development application processes in this amendment, as well as that substantial code that supports those different processes. So in more simple terms, a really big bite, which with this ordinance, we're wanting to take a very specific bite of a very specific topic and tool, which that subdivision component and the idea of developments with more than 2 households versus properties with multi-household, which are 2 different things. We absolutely do want to address it, but we want to address it in what is likely to be one of our next big development code amendments, which is going to be to revamp and readdress some of our subdivision code. So that's why we took it out, as it within the framework of this ordinance, it did not make sense to try to address that right now. So does that answer that completely, Ronnie?
Yeah, thanks for making that clear.
Okay. Anyone else? I think that was it. We just know that there were some lingering questions, but I think we could be ready to move forward. Does that sound okay?
Yep.
Thanks, everyone. Jumping back to the slides here. What we're seeing here is an updated timeline. Really no major adjustment outside of the fact that we did want to adjust the date of the public hearing, which has been submitted to the Times for posting in the newspaper on the 10th, 17th, and 24th, accommodating for the public hearing that will be held during the Planning Commission regular meeting on the 24th. The Planning Commission will not be offering or moving for action for recommendation at this meeting, but we'll be waiting until the special meeting on the 29th. What this is doing is giving the public an opportunity, even more in advance, to come before Planning Commission in a formalized noticing setting to address the draft ordinance. In addition to this, we are supplying an opportunity for a special public comment period during the 22nd council meeting. This is something we're working on to develop an opportunity for this, as well as that 24th meeting and the 29th, as well as the 31st. But our timeline has remained the same with the conclusion of the approval of the ordinance on the 31st, and then of course the backup dates if necessary to accomplish before the pending ordinance close. To run through again just the framework of what we're talking about ordinance wise, in the packet there was the draft active employment ordinance. It was constructed in basically these sections, which was an update to the definitions section of code, MMC, as well as adjustments in the R3 and R4 sections. I'm sorry, that says multi-household. It should be manufactured housing residential zone. And then the third component of adding a chapter specifically to support that active employment households section. So as you recall, in these 2 amendments, it's a single line within the use parameters of that permitted use in those zones. This chapter is what substantially supports that. So this chapter is constructed of a purpose section, general standards, submittal requirements, approval criteria, review procedures, and enforcement. This is consistent with most of our like ordinances, whether it be our site plan application processing chapter, or even our accessory dwelling units, which is very similar, as it is a regulated type use that is allowed in multiple zones. So our ADU ordinance has been constructed very similar to this. There were some questions regarding the permitted uses existing in multi-household zones. So this is the existing multi-household use, multi-household dwelling in the R3 and here in the R4. You'll see that they are indeed mirrored. They are the same, specifically in the developments consisting of 7 or more projects have additional following requirements as such. Why this is a little bit relevant as we get into the framework is I want to identify this break that was proposed in developments 3 or more. We're going to be analyzing these. So basically any multi-household use will include these 3. Then we move to developments of 7 or more, which is the way the code is stated now. So this is the requirement which we are adding to the code. These 2 are pre-existing requirements that used to live within the realm of 7 or more. This has been a continued issue for processing, review, and approval of these development applications. So at the consideration of our engineering, building, and planning departments, it was identified that this would be a appropriate change at this time, so that what these both say is basically when there's a multi-household development, the vehicles that are to be parked off street must enter with a forward ingress and leave with a forward egress. Why this is important is if we were to have multi-household units along a street, at a certain volume, those vehicles that would pull forward into a regular parking spot, like you might in a single household dwelling, and then back into the street, create traffic and safety issues for pedestrians on the sidewalk and traffic issues in the street. This is a section of code that, as we talked about revamping our subdivision code, we have what is a break between a few number of whatever it is, whether it's a subdivision or minor subdivision, or developments less than 7, where these requirements that really should be applied are not. The reason the remainder of the requirements, so garages, carports, landscaping, buffering, and open space or rec room, why I did not include those in the less than 7 requirement, so the 3 or more requirement, is that became a more substantial review of what is multi-household and what do we want. So at this time, we don't want to pop the hood that much. This was a glaring issue that needed to be recovered. We're hopefully addressing this. We can certainly take this out if it's the council's wish and bring these back over to the 7 or more. It would be the recommendation that we include this percentage multi-household section of AEH under the 3 or more section that is displayed here, because that's basically saying that's the use. This is a development condition at a certain point of units. I didn't approach that too gracefully, but hopefully everyone can understand where we were going with that. There was another question that I was hoping to get right off the bat of when AEH might apply. Well, I see it's required for a minimum of 9 months. There's also a component of 90 days. How does that all work? Can I rent it out to somebody that isn't ADH? And really, quite simply, and this is something that we did tackle during the ADU ordinance, is that these consecutive boxes help to explain it, that if there is a designated active employment unit, an AEU, so it's been designated and it must be occupied, it always must be occupied by an active employment household. There is never a situation where somebody could occupy it that does not qualify, that would be a violation for any matter of time. Then within that, we had the condition of, well, what would be the minimum consecutive lease or rent structure? This is mirrored within our ADU ordinance as well, of 90 days. What this does is to better defend against the workaround for nightly rentals. While nightly rentals are included in this as a deed restriction that they will not be, this further allows the enforcement and review process to better establish that there is some sort of lease and it is longer than 30 days, which we know in our community, some folks are leasing out for 30 days and then working that around as a nightly rental kickback option. Then more substantially, the occupancy minimum must be for 9 months in total. That does not have to be consecutive, but broken up amongst the tenants. The reason for a minimum stay at all is that essentially a workaround for this is that the owner, while it could be anybody, second homeowner, anybody can own it. If it's not being occupied, that owner could come and intermittently stay, i.e., circumventing this whole process and utilizing it exactly as a second home, vacation home. So without this component, it undercuts the whole rest of the ordinance. So while it is specific in that kind of substantial way, it is an essential part of the framework to make the enforcement work. I did include these pre-existing slides from BAE as far as scope of work. We won't get into that now. I'm going to stop sharing, and we can return to that. But what I was hoping to do at this point is maybe have Nate and Robert respond in the context of what some of the considerations we might need to be making as a council when we're talking about the content of this framework, or if the council has any issues or additions they'd like to see on the framework itself, not necessarily content. So kind of, again, this is where I think we're going to jump into a more discussion oriented format. So I might, given the structure of topics, if we can respect that structure of topics, I'm going to return, I think, Mayor, if you'd like to start helping delegate the conversation, I'll turn it back to you in the context of Robert and Nate's participation.
Okay. So, so Robert and Nate are going to make a presentation to us, and then I'll just facilitate calling on council members and staff for any questions that you might have.
I think that'd be perfect.
If that works, that's fine. Okay, who wants to go first, Rob or Nate?
I'll take a shot. I don't think we have much of a presentation at this point. We are looking at the ordinance and coordinating with Corey about what our views are and what changes might be appropriate given the legal standards we're needing to operate within. I can say that we have made some suggestions on the whereas clauses. We'll be wanting to include Matt's analysis in that aspect of the ordinance. And I think that analysis will be critical in terms of our legal analysis, in terms of whether some portions may go too far, may not go far enough. We'll be coordinating with Corey and Matt's team to get the details of that. And once we do that, I think we'll have more to say. I don't know that, I think we'll need Nathan's guidance on whether we can do that in a closed session or whether we need to provide that legal opinion in another way so we can protect the legal advice the city is getting. But I think generally, from our perspective, Matt's data and Matt's analysis will be critical to our analysis, and we're going to need that first. Okay. We do have some, I think we're going to have to change some of the current enforcement provisions. We see some necessary changes there. Again, we can go into more detail about that. But at this point, we're actively involved with staff in reviewing the ordinance and waiting for Matt's analysis. I'd be happy to answer questions if there's some about that process, but that's kind of where we are now.
Okay, we did hear back from Nathan, and we can go into an executive session during the workshop and it would be for pending or imminent litigation. So I think we want to hear from Matt, and then when we're done with this discussion in public, then I'll ask for a motion to amend our workshop agenda, and then if that's approved, we'll go into a closed session. So Matt, why don't you, if that works, Rob, is that okay?
Yeah, I think that works fine. I think what we talked about with Corey is maybe having a closed session once we get a little more information from Matt and his team. I don't know that there's enough now that we can say much more than I just said.
Okay.
I think I would like to have a closed session if it's possible, so we can have a very open discussion with the council about some of the risks we see that might cause litigation. Okay. And so that would be my advice, is to have a separate session when we have a little bit more information. But let's go forward and kind of see where we get.
Okay. All right, Matt.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody, or good evening, as it may be. I'm actually going to pass it off to my colleague, Aaron Hussein, who's going to give you the update for what we've been up to most recently and share some preliminary information based on what we've been able to gather. So Aaron, please.
Great. Thanks, Matt. Thank you, members of the council. As I think Corey has summarized before, we're really focused on a couple of core tasks that are really intended to help inform the city's definition of the minimum share of new housing development that would be set aside for active employment households. We're coming at that from really two different perspectives. And what I'll do now is share my screen and show you sort of how some of those calculations are coming together based on preliminary data, and then sort of talk through what it means in terms of setting those percentages. So the first question that we've been tasked with is thinking about the induced workforce housing demand that's created by new housing development. So anytime you build a new unit, if that unit is occupied, that the occupying household will be spending money in the community. That additional spending supports additional retail and commercial jobs, and those workers then also need to be housed. So at a minimum, there's a nexus there between new development and new demand for workforce housing within the community. So our first set of calculations is really focused on framing that. The foundation for our calculations is all based on the city's own internal build-out estimates. So we're getting data from Corey and his team to frame up the total development capacity within the city, and then also to identify the existing inventory of built space within the city. And that leaves us with the additional increment that represents the remaining capacity for new development within the community. So what we're seeing here in column F is the city's estimate of total residential build-out capacity. And I'll note that these numbers are still in refinement, so these will likely shift a little bit by the time you see these numbers again. Column G is existing built residential units, and you'll notice that that's empty as of now. That's because at current, we only have estimates of the total inventory of residential units within the city, and we don't have it broken down by zoning district. We're working with Corey and his team on defining that, so we can get to the next piece, which is the net remaining capacity. Then what we're doing is taking data that we compiled as part of the Assured Housing Study that illustrates the amount of induced residential demand generated with the creation of new housing units, assuming those housing units are occupied. And column I illustrates that data. You'll notice that these numbers change a little bit because we're assuming predominantly different residential unit types within different zones, depending on how the zoning parameters are created. Certain zones are better suited for different types of housing. One good example is the MHRV1 zone, which we're generally assuming is more of a mobile home type product, versus something like the A2 zone, which is going to be more like a rural residential. So based on those multipliers, we come up with total induced jobs based on the residential development in each zone. We then convert that to workforce households based on some data that we processed. It's essentially detailed census data that provides records for individual households, so we can back into the average number of resident workers per household. And then that allows us to kind of convert that total induced jobs number into total induced workforce housing demand. Then there's another key variable, which is the share of the total workforce that actually lives within the city of Moab. Most communities have some type of in and out commute. And so it's pretty rare for communities to house 100% of their workforce. But the in and out commute rate can vary significantly, particularly in communities like Moab that have significant second home markets. There's often pressure on the housing market, which is frankly why you're doing this research, that can kind of push workers outside of the community for residential purposes. Right now, we've set that value at 54%, which is more or less the current in commute rate, or the current resident workforce rate. Then we've done a comparison between the total number of housing units that would be needed to accommodate that workforce pool compared to the total residential capacity within the city, as well as the residential capacity within just the R3, R4 zones, to give you a sense of kind of what that final percentage might be if you're just trying to capture the induced workforce housing demand resulting from new housing development. And again, these numbers will shift a little bit as we refine the build-out estimates, the existing unit counts, as well as that resident workforce share. Any questions on this piece before I move to the sort of second component that we're working on?
Any questions from the council? I can't see you all, so speak up if you have a question. Okay, hearing none.
Great. So then the second piece is to look at total commercial build out within the city of Moab based on the land that you've set aside for commercial development. Assuming that builds out fully at some point in the future, there's going to be a certain amount of employment that would generate. And again, if the community is looking to maintain the current share of the workforce that resides within the city of Moab, what would that mean in terms of the amount of new housing that needs to be set aside for workforce households? So we take a similar approach. This is the estimate of the total commercial capacity within the city of Moab, and this may change a little bit. We're talking to Corey about adjusting the methodology here somewhat. The existing commercial square footage, I think, is probably okay based on some data that Corey and his team pulled together. We then have the net remaining capacity. And I'll highlight some significant differences here in terms of the net remaining capacity and the amount of built capacity that you already have. The city of Moab, both for residential and commercial, has tremendous build-out capacity, or so it seems. We then have assumed square footage per job. So say for a certain retail space of a certain size that has a certain employment density or a certain number of square feet per assumed employee. And we've tailored that based on the types of commercial uses that are predominantly identified within each zoning district. And then we again use that same workers per household conversion to get to workforce households. We then use that resident workforce household conversion rate, again, to get to the total number of workforce households that would be associated with full build out of Moab's commercial inventory. And then when we convert or compare to the city's citywide as well as R3, R4 residential build out capacity, you can get to the share of that total build out capacity that would be needed to accommodate those workforce households. Again, to sort of put that into perspective. Generally speaking, the variables that will affect this most significantly moving forward, or as we make changes to those build out assumptions and existing inventory assumptions, those could make some significant, result in some significant changes to these percentages, as well as if we make any change to that resident workforce assumption in terms of the share of the total workforce that is housed locally. That's a general kind of overview of what we're working on. Happy to take any additional questions, either with regard to the numbers that we just presented or with regard to the changes that we may be making moving forward as we refine these numbers further.
All right, questions from council?
Thank you. That's very interesting. I've been eager to see these numbers, at least in their preliminary form. So I noticed that it's the induced jobs are based on the assured housing study. So the economy has changed a little bit since that was originally done. But are you using that because that's just sort of what's within the budget and scope, as opposed to updating it?
Using the induced demand figures from the assured housing study, does provide some cost efficiencies most certainly, and we're definitely under some constraints there, both in terms of time as well as budget. There's definitely been some changes in the local economy. It's hard to say whether or not those changes have been significant to make a real notable impact on those multipliers without doing that further analysis.
Yep, understood. So I'm curious about the commuter share or the local resident share. It seems like we, like other sort of communities surrounded by public lands, we have a fair number of commuters that are actually driving onto public lands and effectively camping. And so so it's not like another community where there's a lot of adjacent but cheaper private land. And part of our goals, as outlined in our affordable housing plan, is that people have safe and decent housing, and that ultimately 100% of our workforce is housed affordably in Grand County. So that 54% just, I realize that further discussion and elaboration may happen, but just at the outset, I'm not sure if it really aligns with what our aspirations are.
Mm-hmm. We can certainly look at any additional information that's available that can help us understand, the portion of the workforce that is maybe, insecurely housed outside of City of Moab. We can also consider possibly using an assumption kind of informed by the Grand County in commute rate, which is at about 25%. So that's indicating that for the county as a whole, about 75% of the workforce is housed locally. We can, talk with Corey and his team, as well as your legal counsel, to try and sort of better understand how to calibrate that assumption appropriately. Yeah. Again, if you have any additional information, we'd be happy to consider that.
I'd add on to that as well, that, as I think you're observing, Councilmember Jones, there's a policy kind of value embedded in that number to saying, hey, we want to kind of keep doing about as well as we're doing right now with housing workers locally. And that there are always going to be people, for whatever reason, don't live locally. We have seen other jurisdictions with similar affordable housing policies say, well, we feel like we have this sort of regional responsibility to make sure that we're providing housing to the extent that we're creating jobs and creating demand for housing wherever those people may choose to live. We want to kind of make sure that we're not taking the region out of balance, so to speak. And so in a much more aggressive stance, one could possibly look at these things as being, having higher goals for that. But that's really, a policy decision that can, have a lot of implications for, other aspects of your planning and so forth.
Okay, thanks. And then my next question was about sort of aggregating this analysis with the county, because Spanish Valley tends to operate as one job and housing market. But it sounds like you covered that. And then my last question is, one of my concerns is the conversion of existing residential units to second homes, because some of that's happening, and from talking to people in other communities that are similar gateway communities, but further along the gentrification spectrum, that becomes a real problem. And I mean, I hear from housing professionals there that like every primary residence that goes on the market is likely to get converted at this point. And so it seems like much of our stock that isn't protected as AEHs, or AEUs, as we are considering doing, is at risk of conversion. And so it almost seems like what we do in the future is potentially what we're carving out for our workforce. I don't know if that risk is factored into the calculations or not.
Right. As things stand currently, we don't have an assumption to account for existing units that are being pulled out of the inventory that's available for workforce housing. That is something that we could consider accounting for, based on the change in, units that are held vacant for seasonal occasional use reported by the census. We have some data that sort of illustrates that change in seasonally occupied housing. We could try to project that forward. We would also likely want to tie that to some type of estimate of when build out is really expected, because there's a time component there. And again, the city has seemingly significant additional build out capacity, so it could put that ultimate time horizon out there a fair ways. But we'd be happy to work with Corey and his team to do that.
All right, thank you.
Anything else, Kayla? No. Ronnie?
Yeah, no, I'd appreciate what you were just talking about, because it seems like when we originally framed this in discussions in October, and probably even in our resolution, part of the problem we were concerned with was net loss of existing affordable units when redevelopment happens. So anyway, I know I'm interested in that. I didn't know, is this the appropriate time, or should I wait till later to ask, specific questions about the draft ordinance?
Rob, I guess it depends on the question. So why don't you go ahead and ask it, and we'll let Rob tell us if he prefers us to do that in a closed session or not.
Okay, well, some of these are just ones I put on the shared document, and I'm sure Corey just didn't have time to respond, but so the first one was just, if the report from BAE was out, and if we could get a copy, or if so, when we thought we might be able to. I think you had a slides, Corey, that showed what the scope of work was. So can we just get a copy of your slides?
Absolutely, I can share that as well. I would be apologize, there's a voice call over the top of the computer. As far as the data and the report that BAE is at right now, I'm not super comfortable with moving forward with that publishing in a way, because we know that there are specific changes that we need to make already. So again, what the report is mostly to designate the formula and the structure in which they're reporting, not necessarily numbers at this point. As far as the slides, I can absolutely make that available.
I mean, it's partially just a personal workload question, just to know when to expect something. I need to spend time reviewing. Okay. Let's see. This is maybe a side question, but it does seem like it might be pertinent just for us as a group. It's Ty, but we can address it later. But a lot of us do rely on that 2017 affordable housing study that we did with the county. And we know some of the data is, I think the original idea was to update it over time. And so just putting it out there for us as a group. I don't know if this is for strategic planning, but in case you guys from BAE have anything to throw in about best practices and how often we should be updating that data. I'm just thinking, I often look at the charts for income levels for different work sectors in the community to help me understand, what it means to be cost burdened for who. And I just didn't know, as we work through this and other challenges, is there a kind of a best practice advice for us about when we should be updating that?
I'll let Matt take that question.
Sure. Yeah. It really varies. As you know, that's quite an extensive effort to do that analysis. A lot of communities try to do updates periodically. Oftentimes, say when there are in lieu fees involved, they get updated on a inflation adjustment, an annual inflator, and then maybe every 5 or more years, a more comprehensive update is done to really bring things up to date. I think, these relationships, say, between although income levels and housing prices and all that can vary over time as the market shifts, these relationships between the number of jobs created, for example, and the amount of new workforce households, or the amount of market rate housing units created and the amount of new induced workforce households doesn't change as much. So those relationships maybe are a little bit more stable over time. But I think if it was possible to update more comprehensively, say in 5 to 10 year basis, that would be quite good and would put you in good company probably with the other jurisdictions that are working to maintain these kinds of policies and keep them up to date. But I think the truth is that many of them go much longer without that kind of comprehensive update, just because of the the challenges with time and resources to be able to do that.
Okay, yeah, I guess, and my logic may be flawed, but I know, part of my thinking is, there's so much great stuff about the active employment household unit model, but it is, rents and sales will be based on, what the market will bear. And so in some ways, sometimes when I go back and I reflect on what people can actually afford, it gives me a better idea of, how many units we think we need in each AMI category, and who's going to be able to be picked up maybe by those AEHU units, and who we know is going to fall below that and still need different solutions. So okay, thanks. That's just I did have a question specific, and this might be more for staff, but it might involve you guys, certainly the attorneys. When we define who falls under the criteria of our active employment household, when we did accessory dwelling units, and this made sense to me at the time, we included, relatives of the owner. But as I was reading through it this time and seeing that relative category again, it didn't quite make sense to me in this context to have that included. So I did want to ask Corey or one of the attorneys about that.
From the staff perspective, it's criteria 5 within that of the definition of active employment households. What is the criteria to become a qualified active employment household? And it read a family member of the owner of the property. And again, for the ADU, that was a tangible connection that we were hoping to include there. There was some discussion during the drafting of that, how that would work or how we were going to use that in the context of an ADU. While this is a pre-existing definition, that's why we're seeing it here, is because this was already codified and boxed within that pre-approved ADU ordinance. What I'm seeing and how it relates to this ordinance is somewhat benign in the fact that it is there, but in a very rare instance would this ever apply directly anyway. So if there is a second home owner and they had a family member that was living here for more than 3 months at a time for a minimum of 9 months, they would qualify. So whether they were working or not is a second question, but that's why we had included those time parameters in there. So essentially that person it would make sense. So it does not, it's not hurting this ordinance by including it, but it's a rare situation in which that might apply at all. What I would like to do is keep this AEH and EAU definition intact, because what we would have to do at that point is split it unless we wanted to remove that from both ordinances, if that makes sense. If we have an issue with it here, we would be unable to separate it without creating a separate definition. So we would have our active employment household and have to create a mirrored use that just did not include that provision. Does that make sense? Not too much.
I'll think about that and I can talk to you separately about it.
Okay, that sounds good.
Let's see. Then just kind of a silly question, but just so I know when we have to set it. We have this section, I think it's
The rates.
yeah, about rates. Is that
Yes.
something because we developed the ordinance that the council sets, or is that the same as the $100 a day lien?
Well, and again, what I want to really profile is that this is the framework of the ordinance is really what I was hoping to provide. But of course, to create the framework, you need to put some content in there. So what we ended up drafting, or I ended up drafting in this context, was what seemed to be appropriate from existing enforcement strategies used for ADUs or other enforcement sections of our code, supplemented with scenarios that would be essential as far as the active employment component of it. So like the elements we used in the development agreement previously where AEH was recognized. So at Robert's earlier point, and to the addition of Mona Pompeli's review of this, so we sent out to code compliance and got a reaction back that was similar to Robert's, that it may be the most appropriate and make the most sense to remove a good body of this enforcement section from this ordinance and then revert back to the appropriate processes that are already outlined in the municipal code. So rather than generating an enforcement procedure and regulations just for AEH, we say if it's in violation, it goes to code compliance and it'll follow those processes. So that I think lines up with what Robert's comment was, as well as Mona's, as well as staff's. But for the sake of this discussion, really wanted to put some body there that we'd start somewhere and we could certainly we take it right out, which I think is the direction at this point. So the rates would be part of that would be removed because we don't currently have structure identified to do that.
Okay, and I think my last one, which can wait for a time when the attorneys aren't here, but it is relevant to this discussion, was at what point do we as a council discuss the budget impacts of implementing an ordinance like this, just so we can understand the staff time, salary, benefits that would be involved in monitoring and administrating something like this. So just at some point before we have to vote on something like this, it would be, I'm throwing it out there, it would be helpful to know that.
Great, thanks, Ronnie. And I encourage you to follow up with staff for your last question. That's a good point. Luke, do you have any questions?
Not too much, but just to make sure like I'm getting better or I'm understanding things correctly. So when we were looking at the residential build out spreadsheet, right now we don't have a number of the existing ones. So as we get those numbers put together, we're assuming that percentage required is going to go up, correct?
For the residential build out, the new workforce demand will go down. Right now, the percentage shown is based on total residential build out within the city, including what's existing. And so what we'll do when we add in the existing unit totals will be to net out the existing from the remaining capacity. So then the percentage will be based on just future build out of residential, the existing residential or remaining residential capacity.
Okay. That's it.
Sure.
Thanks, Luke. Jason.
I don't right now. I do, but I don't right now. That's it.
All right, good. Kaylin,
So I have more, but I don't know in terms of the anticipated, the scheme of the workshop, if more is needed now or if you want to move on. But I do have more questions.
why don't you go ahead and ask them? We've got folks in the room now. Go ahead.
Okay, so in the original assured housing study, another component of it was financial feasibility. And part of, at least my goal is that I am hoping that the combination of market rate and AEU units will, the more that AEU units will get built, and so we don't want it to be so onerous that nothing happens and we just lock into the current development. But I'm also aware that, as I understand it, this is being constructed so that it's not an exaction. And so maybe financial feasibility is not technically even a consideration. But I'm wondering if that is something that is the team is thinking about. I'm also aware that the county's HDHO ordinance had an 80%, I think, set aside for active employment households. I realize it's not an apples to oranges comparison because of their underlying base density, and that was more of a bonus situation. But just wondering if that's a consideration in the code development. Financial feasibility.
Well, from our perspective, that, whether or not this is an exaction is certainly something we're looking at very closely. So if that answers your question, that is going to be a serious consideration. I think the question we have is whether we're causing an individual developer to bear a burden that's not proportionate to the impact his development is causing. And I think that's why Matt and Aaron's analysis is very important. I mean, we can't ask a particular new developer to solve our citywide problem if he's not contributing to it, if that makes sense. And that's the kind of the overarching concern from an exaction standpoint. Does that help, Councilman Jones?
Yes, it does. Thank you. And it's fine to call me by my first name if you want. We're not that formal around here, typically. So let's see, I have various edits on, I realize it's early, but I did notice a fair number of smallish things on the draft ordinance, which maybe I should just send to Corey.
Yeah.
A bigger thing that I wondered about was, that wasn't included, was I was wondering about amending the objectives and characteristics of R3 and R4 to highlight our evolving intent around them by adding, so for example, with R3, it states, the objective in establishing the R3 residential zone is to provide appropriate locations within the city for high density residential development. And then I wondered about adding primarily occupied by full-time residents and employees and owners of local businesses to establish intent right from the beginning of the zone. I don't know if that's going too far, but I wanted to throw it out as a concept.
Corey, what do you think?
From the staff perspective, the objectives and characteristics or purposes of those variable sections, whether it's zones or chapters supporting ordinances, are used not inevitably in the legal parameters in which we're going to evaluate something, but it certainly does inform the same way our whereas clause will specifically for an ordinance inform intention. Therefore, if there is a discrepancy or there is an opportunity for interpretation, that is the next place that we look of, okay, here's the framework bounds that we will legally address. And then if there is discrepancy or question, we'll then look at the purposes, interpretations of the zone, of the ordinance, whatever it is, to tease out better what we can do. So would changing the objectives and characteristics create issue. It would not, in my mind, as far as what we're doing now or what the content of the zone would be. However, to what ends we might see that effective, I'm not so sure. I think the way it is parametered, as it was read by you just now, it seems consistent, but it puts the cherry on top, certainly.
Okay, thanks. And would you like us to debate the parking change?
That'd be great. I mean, at this point, we have, as far as my scheduled workshop, I think we've addressed all the major chunks that we'd like to have. Maybe before we do get into that, we maybe can reconsider if we do want more time to discuss with Robert in a potential closed session based off the understanding BA gave. So maybe re-ask that question and see if there's something more pertinent, but there's a number of little things that I'd love to get into with the council's participation, but want to eat that one big chunk if we do want to go down that road. So Joette, I'm not sure if at your direction you'd
Well, I'm really interested in the parking
okay.
piece too, but I know that we're under the gun, and I know that we'd like to go into closed session with Rob and other attorneys in the room. So if we could, how much time, Rob, are you going to feel like you're going to need to talk to us in closed session?
Sorry, Rob, you're on mute.
You're muted.
Thank you. I think we have a couple of considerations and problems with going into a closed session right now. Nate is still on, but Danny is not. I'd like to have both of them available for a closed session. I think Nate's, although he's apparently on, I think he's on another call according to his text. So I think, timing aside, I think we need our team to be available. So again, going back to my earlier comment, I think it would be most helpful if we could have half an hour, 45 minutes, or even an hour in a separately noticed closed session. I think that would be easier as soon as we could set it up.
Well, why don't we go ahead and have the parking discussion and see if your team shows up, because we have until 5:45 really. And maybe you can reach out to them and see if they're available, so that we don't have to schedule another meeting if possible. And let's Corey, if you're okay with it, I would love to hear what council has to say about the parking provisions. And then if we could take 15 minutes to have that conversation and see where we're at with the attorneys and go from there. Does that sound okay to everybody? Yeah, good. All right, Caitlin, let's talk about parking.
So my initial response, I hadn't really thought about it before today, but is that on balance, I'm inclined to keep it for developments of more than 7 units. The reasons are land use efficiency. We have a housing crisis, but I don't see that we necessarily have a backing out traffic accident crisis in R3. We do have quite a bit of diagonal parking in the downtown core, which people manage to negotiate on higher volume streets. And we're going to be adding to that in the near future. And so I just feel like, when I think about a lot of the lots in R3, they're small enough that if they're on a corner, like one recent development, then they can have like a mini alley. But for mid-block lots, it could impact the number of units they can fit on. Or they might have to have a turnaround provision. If they divide it, say if you have a townhouse development with narrow lots, it could be difficult to have a place to turn around prior to getting onto the street. Or it might require just create more paving. We're hoping that they maintain some landscaping, even though there's a lot of off-street parking lined up there. So on balance, I favor just leaving it for more than 7 rather than more than 3.
Other council members.
I got a question on that too. On the 7, it's saying that garages or carports should not be located in the front yard and should be set back from the front wall from the municipal structure, at least 15 feet. So if I'm understanding this right, like the apartment complex that's on, or the townhomes that are down on River Sands and what is that, 4th North on the corner there, the green ones, you know what I'm talking about, that have garages in the front, those would not be permitted under this?
Well, we want to, and that's what part of the discrepancy between variable options is, that is actually a different type of development process. So those townhomes or twin homes end up having a different set of requirements. So what we're looking at here, and I'll share a screen just so I'm a little bit more visual this way. It may help. Is that the provisions here, so that 7 or more, or what was, what we see here as the whole code of basically there's a gap between 3 and 6. That is consistent also with our site plan application development and our major subdivision development. So to your point, Jason, when property is being divided, it gets thrown into a totally different category. If the property is maintained as a whole, then we're looking at a multi-household development of many units. If there are units, say 6 dwellings, and we require 1.5 for each of those, and then the developer ends up supplying, we'll call it 2, just for sake of ease, 2 parking spaces per unit. So now you have 12 parking spaces that in years past in some properties, and we don't process them this way before, but you'll notice in some developments, there's a span of curb cut that runs the length of 9 feet wide, which is the width of a standard parking spot, times those 12. So you end up with this expanse of parking oriented in the front of a structure that does not get kicked into what is what we're going to call that 7 or more, which is really when we're talking apartments. We're talking bigger structures, open space, traditional parking lots. So there's what is occurred is there's a hole. There's this hole in the code and this strange hole in developments where there is a very high impact in relation to 6 or 7 that doesn't have the requirements that 7 does. So what we'll see a lot of time is a developer will come in and they say, well, what is the most streamlined process? And we say, well, if you develop 6 or less units, you're not subdividing. Likely in that scenario, you're doing some sort of development and then an overlay of ownership of some kind. But then you go straight to building permit process. So it doesn't require site plan or planning commission review. And with that, you don't get the open space, you don't get the buffering, you don't get the landscape, you don't get any of those additional items, which is fine. Because what we're trying to do is make development approachable on a smaller scale. But what we're seeing, especially with the parking, is where that rubber is meeting the road, pun intended, issue, where there are a larger number of vehicles and traffic coming in and out that isn't regulated like the standards might be for a larger development. So the result from the engineer, our city engineer, from this is it's a major issue for him. That doesn't mean it's a major issue for everybody. Sometimes planning disagrees with engineering about street widths and use of how the right of way works. But I think between building planning and engineering, we've identified this as an issue. So we thought at this time, it would have been an appropriate time to change at least that requirement that the forward ingress and egress is required. But to Kaylin's point, that does have implications of how the land is accommodated on the lot. They'll still have the same number of parking spots, but what they may not have is a circulation pattern that in our terms is safer and better. They could get away with a circulation pattern that is less regular and still meet code. So they still have to meet the standards of engineering and traffic studies and all those things, but this is just, it's one thing that doesn't help us with developments developing well.
All right, thanks. No, I agree with Kalen, what he was saying on that as well.
Luke or Ronnie, questions on parking? No? Luke?
No question, just a comment. I think I kind of agree with Kaylin and Jason in regards to just like the overall kind of development of Moab. I know we want to promote like kind of like larger high density projects, but I think overall still it's going to be more of those like smaller development things. And so just kind of putting the weight on those smaller developments and kind of a more efficient use of space makes a little bit more sense on my part. But I get like the safety concerns and kind of all that other stuff.
That's a great comment. I'd love to address that really quick before we move on. Is that those are two elements. So we're wanting to make development easier, and then in relation to parking, what we're compromising here is we're saying, well, we're going to require you have more spaces, but we organize it less well. Rather than maybe we decrease the required parking from 1.5 to 1.25 or whatever it is to maybe alleviate and create less burden as far as the spaces go, but maybe maintain the circulation in a pattern that is maybe going to happen via a bunch of other code that ends up resulting in this. Because what we get is people will eventually work their way into some parking circulation that is less desirable. We'll just put it that way. It just doesn't, from a practical standpoint, work very well. So it's kind of you're still parking very high and it's circulated poorly, versus park less and circulate well. You might even still reduce the land use. But I love the conversation that Kaylin brought up. Jason's confirmed, and Luke, I agree. We need to address parking, I think, is the underlying issue here. Period. So if we don't include it in this ordinance, absolutely fine. No heartburn there. We'll include the percentage AEH as 3 or more, and everything else will be 7 or more. I'm perfectly fine with that, but really the conversation is spurring in a really great direction.
Ronnie.
Corey, maybe just for a little more context on, since you did say it was building, planning, and engineering kind of agreeing on safety issues, and we're trying to move to a community that's more supportive of adaptive transportation. So when we talk about safety, are we talking about all elements of safety, or more so pedestrian, kind of sidewalk traffic, or just, other vehicles in the road? I mean, everything?
Well, and you'll see in that section of code, there's 2 parts. One is parking, one is access. The parking is off-stream parking shall not be designated in a way as to allow vehicles to pull forward on the street. The other is provide such a way as it does not impede traffic patterns in adjacent streets. That gives our city engineer the opportunity to say, well, if we're parking a property in a way that they have to back out across a lane of traffic into another lane with a blind sidewalk for pedestrians or a bike lane, they would be permitted to do that without a review. We're not saying they couldn't, but without this element, we couldn't tell them no because there's a bike lane and a blind pedestrian path. We would say, well, you park it because you're under 6, you can park it how you wish. So it's not immediately imposing new regulations that wouldn't occur anyway, but it does give us a better opportunity to say, hey, there's clearly an issue. We need to mitigate that, as opposed to, oh, there's no issue. We're not going to require you to use whatever it may be. So there's 2 components there, and I think you've identified that well. When we're talking about safety, we're looking at pedestrian, bike, and traffic flow specifically. So on-site circulation is not a safety consideration. It's when you go into the right of way.
Okay, great, thanks.
Anybody else? Conversation about parking. Sounds like we're going to have more conversation about this in the future. And I guess Rob and Nate, where are you guys with having a more deep legal conversation?
So we're available. I think we do have the team ready to talk. I do have consideration, and I hate to be too loiterly about this, but I do have some concerns about going into closed session at this point to talk about an ordinance. I think the question is whether litigation is reasonably imminent.
Okay,
I have had one discussion with a lawyer today about the ordinance. He expressly did not threaten litigation. He did had some questions. Corey, have you had anybody contact you that you felt like was threatening litigation?
The statement I'll give here is that one of the two developers that are currently have applications in under the resolution period had contacted me, and as in the discussions of where we're at with the ordinance, that they will have to come into compliance or they can remove their project, basically. What this status is that Robert has given before about those projects that are in that resolution period. His comment was that they are going to speak to their attorneys and consider what legal recourse there may be. And then as a result of that, I said, may our attorney contact your attorney? And I said, that would be fine. That was where we concluded. So there wasn't an explicit call, but it was in a matter that said, if the number comes out where they don't want it, they are going to explore options. So I don't know what that means from my perspective, but
we don't think that's enough to close the session. I think what we're going to need to do is sort of evaluate those kind of threats. If we actually get one, I think we can have a closed session. I think what we're going to have to do is give you our legal advice, either by a legal memorandum or by small group sessions where we don't have the whole council available, maybe by one or two council members, and we can address these issues that way. But I don't feel like we're justified at this point in going into a closed session. I would like to talk to Nathan about that and see if he has, obviously he may be having a different consideration, but I'm not sure he understands all the dynamics, if that makes sense.
yeah,
So
no,
I hate to put you off, but I think the safer bet is not to do that at this point.
that sounds fine. I appreciate you and bringing that up and expressing that. I think that's great. So do we have any more? What I'll do, Rob, is let Carly and Corey figure out how best to inform the council, legal memo, or one-on-one conversations, however you feel is the best way to do that. And I just want to see if there's any more questions or information that we want to share with the council. And if the council has any questions or discussion items, Luke, it looks like you're unmuted. I don't know if that means you want to say something, but that's kind of my cue on Zoom.
Yeah, I do. I wanted to, I guess, kind of like piggyback off of Ronnie's request for extra information about the potential costs in terms of enforcing this. I was wondering if we could look into kind of maybe not a complaint-based code compliance. I don't know that complaint-based one, like current complaint-based code enforcement is super effective. And I feel like it kind of puts the onus on the residents within the community to have a really firm understanding of the ordinance. I don't want city staff to necessarily get, particularly early on, a lot of kind of incorrect calls about, and yeah, I feel like it kind of opens things up to neighbor grievances, to be calling into the department about like misuse of the AEH or AU amendment. And so I'd be interested to see like what kind of efforts you foresee there being if we had like a dedicated staff towards looking at something like this.
Yeah, Corey, I just want to, Luke, that's a really good question. And I think it's a bigger discussion that we have to have overall, looking at code enforcement and code compliance. But Corey, why don't you go ahead and respond, and then Kaylin. I mean, we're kind of going a little bit off topic of the reason for this workshop, but I think it's a good conversation to have because, enforcement of this AEU is going to be an interesting, that's what everybody's going to want to know. How are we going to enforce that, and how effective is that enforcement going to be? So Corey, why don't you go ahead, and then Kaylin, your comments.
thank you. Yeah, again, we're looking at framework of the ordinance, but the content that was in place, and then even the structure of the whole chapter is intended to be enforceable the way that we regulate most land use functions. So while complaint-based is one of the branches of that, the way this would likely be organized is very similar to the way that we get notified about ADUs. So if there is a complaint-based, it's usually about nightly rental, which is uniform across a lot of these mechanisms. But what often happens is we're dealing with intervals of review, and that's how we're going to mostly organize this enforcement, is during the review, approval, and processing of the applications. That's our first initial ability to regulate and require. Once those folks get their CO or get their approval and they go out the door, just like they with a building permit is a good analysis for this. They get their CO for a structure. We don't have any way to understand if they took a sledgehammer to the interior of their walls until somebody else goes in there, whether that's the assessor at the time of refinancing or an assessor at a time of valuation, whatever it is. There's a median interval there. That's where we've caught a number, caught maybe is not the right word, but we've become informed and in some situations caught of illegal conversions of structures built without permits, as in additional dwellings, or the content in which that structure is operating. So that the review process is the initial, and then there are intervals during the occupation or use of those, and then the sale or transition of property at the end where it goes to a new owner. The city is plugged in at all three of those points. That's our interval for review, which is similar to how we review all of our land use specific issues, rather than complaint-based, which is a slightly different function. With that, the deed restrictions, I've contacted John Cortez and walked through what we can use best to accommodate that. And the way the deed restrictions are structured in the draft ordinance should be reflective of that ability that every time there's a title search, every time that there's an owner inquiry, that deed is going to come up and be shown so that there is awareness at each of those three intervals. That's again, our standard enforcement across the board for all land use items. If we want to go above and beyond on this, whether it's inclusions of ADUs and the active employment households through a good landlords program or another participatory program where we're bringing in what we might call policing, where there's increased interval of interaction, where they're either having to renew, come back in, discuss, that would be the increase. So to Ronnie's question, what does the budget look like now? It looks exactly like we look like right now, in addition to all the other use parameters that we deal with. If we change a landscaping ordinance, it will be the same review process for that landscaping ordinance, ensuring it's in compliance throughout its lifetime. While we're adding to the list, I'm not saying it's less work, it is more work, but it falls to the same people that are already existing in the structure of our review, approval, and enforcement arenas. So bringing somebody else that Mona has talked about individually just to handle these would absolutely increase our breadth of work that we can do to better police and operate these. But I feel that we are capable as of now to accommodate this ordinance the way it's drafted. So a lot of different topics there. Thank you for letting me ramble, but that was a very important component I was eager to talk about. Sorry, Joy, you're muted there.
I appreciate that. But aside from that, I think there's a bigger conversation we have to have about code enforcement in general. But Kaylin, you had a comment.
It's on a different topic. So if
Okay.
other people want to continue this, I can wait.
Okay. Any other, Jason?
Well, I had a comment. It's on a different topic, but my topic or my I'm wondering is what's the next step? You know, I think the next step in this is to figure out what the the 0% is in this whole thing. So, because I feel like the 0% is going to dictate kind of where like Rob and Nate kind of go with how susceptible we are to something happening, you know, and so that's what's the next step from here on that?
I think you've nailed that perfectly. I think is to continue to get the correct data supporting the formula that BAE's come up with, get that number resulting all the way through that we're confident in, and then with that number, be able to have the structure of the formula, not just the number. And that's what I think Rob's major point was, is it's the structure of the formula in addition to the number that is going to, through the whereas clause of the ordinance, give us our rational basis parameter to move forward. So I think you're exactly right, Jason. That is the lineage of how we need to move forward, is those three things.
And my expectation is that Matt and Aaron are going to come up with that number relatively soon. Correct?
That's the intention.
That is the intention, the hope. The burden is on our city to help them get those numbers. So the engineering department, in particular, Didar Charles, our associate engineer, has been helping me with this. It is time intensive to produce those from the sheets and sheets of material that do come out of the county, which is doesn't yield itself to easy manipulation without time. So that's what we're trying to do. So we're hoping to get that to BAE, that they can run that, and then prior to even our next meeting, by the 17th is the hope, if not before then, to have a formulator that is structured, therefore that Robert and Nate can take it from there, because again, that structure of the formula is important to them as well. So we want that all intact prior to the week of the 22nd, when you'll talk to them next.
Okay, that sounds great. And then perhaps, Rob, we could have an executive session if needed at our next meeting on the 22nd. But I'm going to let Carly and Corey determine how best to move forward with getting the legal advice from you. So, Kaylin.
So this is a question about the following provision, which is about midway in the whole code. Active employment unit shall be of a quality, both aesthetically and respect to the standard construction, that is not materially different from the free market units. So I'll start with a question, and then I might have a comment. Could you specify how broad materially different can be?
The specification may be difficult in an essence that there is placing discretion on the land use authority here, which would be either the staff at a building permit application level, or planning commission at site plan, or in a rare case, there's a combination of preliminary plat and plan. It may even go to city council for approval of that final plan. So what I'd like to not do is get into the weeds of it. If it's organic material based, then it has to be organic material based, because what we get in there when we start defining out too closely is we have things that spill over the back that are not accounted for, and creates discrepancy there. So I think the idea is that it is rough, and I believe the language is included there to be roughly consistent. Therefore, that's a interpretive element that the land authority could have. It's not to place too much burden on the developer if that is unrealistic throughout the development, or stylistically not realistic, or place too much burden on the land authority to be confined to a certain provision. And we do have elements of that where it's been defined out, and it places the burden on the planning and building department to make those interpretations, which are issues for us.
Okay, thank you. I guess so. My thought behind the question was that I'm less concerned about interior aesthetics. I can imagine that for luxury units, a developer may want to go to a higher standard and then price it appropriately, and that could help the economics of the project overall. But I am interested, given our sustainability goals, in having the energy efficiency and possible on-site renewable energy generation be the same or better for the AEUs. And ultimately, that is to the benefit of the attainability of those units, in that the operational costs will be, all other things being equal, be the same or less than the free market units.
I see that line of thinking, and I think we can explore that further. What that does do, though, is then deviates from the concept that these are equally split. The project is set equal, consistent throughout, number and types of use, and then you take that slice of the pie. What you're saying now is, of this slice of the pie, you have to treat it differently, and I think there's going to be legal implications from that.
That wasn't my intent. My intent was just to tighten up the materially difference for basically the building shell and HVAC performance.
And then within that larger context, I think I hear you there as well. What I'd like to do is maybe a different tool that would require that across the breadth of residential, not just AEH or just within R3, R4, is that new developments, here's our new standard for structures. And that is not dissimilar than our landscaping conversations we've had with the WaterWise resource presentation, but it would be linked in there. I think it was an appropriate separate tool used in the same development.
Okay.
There.
Right. Well, that's a separate project that I'm interested in the city pursuing. So presuming it gets addressed sometime, I'm happy with that.
Luke.
Yeah, I had something else kind of pop into my head, and Matt, I'm not sure if this is like feasible to incorporate into kind of the analysis, but I was thinking that potentially the limiting factor in the potential build out isn't necessarily like the density within the zoning, but the actual water availability. And so is there any sort of way to potentially look at like current water usage and see if we have like the ranges of estimates as to like how much available water we actually have that's available to our local area. And I'm wondering if that potentially actually limits the amount of new development that can occur in a sustainable manner.
I'd have to defer to city staff on that question. Of course, I think it can affect both the residential build out as well as the commercial build out potentially. But we're just not at a level of familiarity with your city situation to know how that might pan out over the long term.
Right. And, I guess in the same vein, is it possible, once we pass this, whatever the percentage is, because we don't have that answer yet, Luke. And I know that we're looking at that. And I'm wondering, down the road, once we have that, if we could reevaluate this ordinance and amend it based on what we find out from our water resource management and other things that we're doing to determine where we are with future development. Because I know we don't have that answer yet, and I think it would be hard to incorporate it without knowing. But it's something I think we need to be paying attention to, and perhaps once we do have some better answers, relook at this ordinance down the road.
I would concur with that, and then not even just this ordinance, but throughout. Again, kind of like
Right.
Caitlin said, I think once we get these better parameters for our standards of development, our use parameters and those development standards, I don't think we need to identify them particularly kind of in more single-handed tool sections. We can use blanket elements to accomplish those larger concepts.
Okay.
What I might defer to Robert is about will we be able to come back and amend this? Well, I believe my understanding with the current legislation that's going on, that this is not under the umbrella that could potentially be removed from a municipality's toolbox, so to speak, as far as
Not yet.
So I don't know. Robert would be the one to say, can we come back? I think we can.
So far, like the mayor says, so far we can.
Okay.
Jason, did you have something? Yes.
I did. I guess this goes back to what Kaylin was just talking about. I want to see if I understand this right. So if a contractor or developer comes in and builds these units at $300 a square foot for the main ones, and then wants to turn around, and then the ones that are going to be set aside for active employment units, those need to be also built at a $300 per square foot unit price as well. Because I wonder if like a developer is going to go, hey, this isn't affordable for me. I can build these ones at 300, then I'm going to build this unit at $150 a square foot to be able to put it at a price point to where the project pays off, you know? And so are we going to deter developers to go, hey, this isn't going to work, you know, or else I'm going to be at a loss?
No, that's a great distinction. And what I believe we framed the ordinance to do here is not interfere with this. So to the extent of $300 a square foot here, 150 there, what the provision says explicitly is of quality, both aesthetically and with respect to the standard construction that is not materially different from the free market units, meaning you're not having steel frame construction for 9 units and wood framed or block framed for the other 3, or
right.
that you're having, you know, whatever it be, shingled roof on some, and then changes dramatically for the 3 that they're something else. We're looking for general cohesion among the project. We're not getting down into limiting the developer in that way out of what is reasonable. I think if it's clear that if there's a really nice development here and then a slum here, that's not what we want. And every developer I've talked to says, we wouldn't build that. That doesn't make sense. So there isn't a lot of pushback of people trying to get around things. They want development that people are going to want to live in and they're going to be proud of. So our response to that has been keeping that in the scope of the ordinance, but not trying to tighten the screws down on anybody. That exactly for the tool you're saying, that is going to be maybe a mechanism that they use to make it attainable and affordable by price, and that the supplementary profit can then help counter as well as far as
okay, perfect.
So you're right on, absolutely.
And Corey, during the planning commission, you said that there's a pretty healthy margin right now in terms of like building cost and like sale costs, correct?
I'm not an economist. We have some folks here that might be able to better answer that, but that's my understanding, is that just from having been dealing with it explicitly, the cost of construction square foot is double or greater than double profit cost of sale of square footage, if that makes sense. That is data that I have seen, that if projects are being built in the range of 275 or 300 square foot, they're being sold in the range of 600 to 800 square foot, if not higher in some scenarios.
Wow. All right, we are getting close to time when we should probably close this discussion. I want to reiterate Jason's comments on next steps. I'm wondering, Corey, if it might not be a good idea to have on our next agenda another update in our meeting. Tell me what you think. This is just a thought that I'm having, so that we can help guide the planning commissioners in their conversation, because by then, hopefully, we're going to have this percentage number. And I don't want us to get in a scenario where it goes to the planning commission, comes back to the council, and we don't agree. And so I know it's kind of backwards, but since we're kind of in this analysis phase, I thought it might be a good idea for us to have an update at our next meeting from Matt and Aaron on where they're looking at that number to be, and then Luke can take that back. Whatever our conversation is about that, then Luke can take it back to the planning commission and kind of give them some heads up as to where the council is going. What are your thoughts on that?
That's consistent with what we have planned. The idea to do the grunt work of getting the framework, the content organized prior to, so that you have not just a rough draft of framework, but a rough draft, something really, this is what we're starting to move forward with on the 22nd. That's a regular meeting. That will also include, hopefully, a special public comment period that we would love the the public to start organizing. We'll get with Summer to ensure that we're doing that the way we need to, participating so that the public feels that they've engaged in this enough. We are coordinating outreach on our website as well to profile everything we're talking about as well as moving forward. But then that 22nd meeting would then yield for the public hearing on the 24th for the Planning Commission to have a result from that city council meeting saying, this is what city council found out of the data. This is how they'd like to move forward. Here's what the public has to say and what the recommendation planning is. And then it comes back to city council. So like you're saying, it's backwards, but that's exactly the way the recommendation should be framed. And
Okay. Is council okay with that plan? Does that sound good to everybody? Yes? All right, and then in the meantime, Rob, if you and your team could get together with Nathan and staff to determine how best we want to move forward with our legal conversation. And if we need, and if you feel it's appropriate, we could probably have an executive session at that meeting on the 22nd, or what we talked about is just meeting individually with council members or sending a memo. So coordinate that with staff. Anything else? One last call for anything, Corey?
We did want to have an opportunity while Rob's here, if there's questions about the lot consolidations that we're going to see later this evening. I know it was linked into this conversation, right, despite those being independent actions. So just wanted to ensure that we had Rob, if he's, if we have legal questions there.
I think we'll probably, as Rob, are you going to be at the meeting this evening, or do you want council to be able to ask questions on the lot consolidation at this time while we have an attorney, Ronnie?
This would be preferable if that's possible, then.
Oh, I don't feel like I have any questions. Thanks for the information you sent via Carly. That answered my questions. Thanks, Rob. That's great.
All right, very good. Anybody else have any questions for Rob regarding the agenda item on consolidation of the two lots this evening? All right, very good. I'm going to let everybody know before I close the workshop that we do have a conflict with a couple council members on having workshops on the second Tuesday of the month, because there's another committee meeting that happens around the same time. So if we have workshops in the future on the second Tuesday, they would have to be at 5 o'clock or earlier in the day around the lunch hour. I know for Ronnie that works out best, and for those of us that are working, so, but on the fourth Tuesday, we can start at 4. So I just wanted to let everybody know that on the second Tuesday of the month, we will not be having workshops that start at 4 o'clock. Kaylin, I see you're unmuted. You have something to say about that?
I'm just going to say that the travel council, some of the other members were appreciative of the deadline that we set by having a 4 p.m. workshop, which caused their meeting to be, shall we say, more efficient.
Well, if you can convince the travel council to change their time, that would be awesome. Let us know. But in the meantime, we will not have workshops that start before 5 o'clock, unless it's going to be something that's going to be several hours and we need to do it earlier in the day. But we'll give you all several, we'll give you plenty of notice.
All right, thanks.
You bet. Okay, that's it, you guys. We'll see you in 20 minutes or 15 minutes. We need to go into the Zoom meeting for the regular council meeting. So this Zoom will end and we'll see you shortly. Thank you. Great discussion. Thank you guys for coming. Really appreciate you being here.